Dearest listeners, there exists a particular species of woman in our society whom the ton regards with mingled fascination and horror, the confirmed spinster who has refused every eligible offer and seems determined to embrace her unmarried state with unseemly contentment. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of one such woman, whose intelligence proved as formidable as her fortune, and whose heart, though thoroughly guarded, was not quite so impervious as she believed. I do trust you have already shown your approval for such chronicles with a simple like, and have subscribed to ensure you do not miss a single tale whispered among the ton. But let us not rush forward with indecorous haste, for the best stories, like the finest embroidery, must be savored stitch by stitch, their full pattern revealed only in proper time. The spring of 1815 found Miss Theodora Sinclair in her 28th year, an age at which most women of her station had either secured respectable marriages or resigned themselves to the permanent care of relations. Theodora, however, belonged to neither category. She possessed that rarest of commodities for an unmarried woman, complete financial independence, courtesy of her maternal grandmother's considerable fortune, which had been settled upon her with such ironclad legal precision that not even her father's most creative solicitors could breach its terms. The Sinclair residence in Grosvenor Square stood as a testament to old money and older prejudices. Sir Edmund Sinclair, Baronet, had produced 3 daughters and no sons, a failure that had soured his disposition considerably over the years. His elder daughters had married respectably, if not brilliantly, Arabella to a country squire with more acres than conversation, and Henrietta to a naval captain whose prize money had exceeded expectations. Theodora, the youngest and by far the most troublesome, had refused no fewer than 12 proposals over the course of 10 years, each rejection adding another layer to her reputation as an unnatural female who valued books over babies and independence over the matrimonial state. The drawing room where Theodora spent her mornings resembled more a gentleman's library than a lady's private sanctuary. Books in Greek and Latin lined shelves that should have displayed fashion plates and sentimental novels. Her writing desk overflowed with correspondence from scholars, reformers, and other persons of intellectual bent who recognized in her anonymous essays a mind of considerable acuity. For Theodora possessed a secret that would have scandalized even those who already considered her beyond the pale. She wrote political commentary under the masculine pseudonym of T. Blackwell, and her essays on parliamentary reform and the rights of property owners had been published in several respected journals. That particular morning, as April sunshine filtered through the tall windows overlooking the square, Theodora sat reviewing the latest proof sheets from her publisher when her father's heavy tread announced his approach. Sir Edmund entered without knocking, as was his custom when dealing with a daughter who had forfeited the right to privacy by refusing to behave as daughters ought. The ensuing confrontation required no words to convey its essence. Sir Edmund presented yet another potential husband, Viscount Hartley, a widower of 63 years, seeking a young wife to provide the heir his first marriage had failed to produce. The settlement would be generous, the title respectable, and the expectation quite clear. Theodora's refusal, delivered with the calm precision of one who had rehearsed this scene many times before, transformed her father's complexion to an alarming shade of crimson. What followed was a battle of wills conducted across the polished mahogany of the drawing-room table. Sir Edmund played his strongest card, the threat of social ostracism, of being cut off from family gatherings, of being branded as the peculiar relation whom nobody quite knew how to manage. Theodora countered with the unassailable fortress of her independent income and the inconvenient truth that her grandmother's will explicitly forbade any interference with her granddaughter's choices. The contest ended, as such contests always did, in stalemate. But this time, Sir Edmund's parting words carried a new and troubling venom. The baronet informed his daughter that her continued presence under his roof had become an embarrassment to her sisters, whose daughters were now approaching marriageable age. To have an aunt who was an acknowledged oddity might prove contagious. Arrangements would be made, connections explored, and if Theodora would not accept a husband through the conventional channels, perhaps less conventional methods might be employed. The laws surrounding unmarried women and their supposed need for male protection contained many interesting provisions that a determined father might exploit. Left alone, Theodora felt for the first time the cold touch of genuine fear. Her fortune protected her from poverty, but not from legal maneuvering. An unmarried woman, no matter how wealthy, remained a perpetual minor in the eyes of the law. Her father could not touch her money, but he could potentially have her declared in need of protection, could argue that her rejection of suitable offers indicated an unsound mind, could make her life so thoroughly miserable that even her beloved independence would seem a burden rather than a blessing. She envisioned the concrete horror of it, her books confiscated, her fortune administered by some guardian appointed by her father, and herself perhaps confined under the care of a physician who would interpret her intelligence as hysteria requiring treatment. Freedom was no longer an abstract concept. It was territory to be defended at any cost. She moved to the window and gazed down upon the square where fashionable society paraded its conventions with metronomic regularity. Somewhere in this vast city of marriages made for money, position, and the perpetuation of bloodlines, there had to exist another soul who valued freedom as she did, who understood that matrimony need not be a prison if both parties approached it as a business arrangement rather than a romantic entanglement. The thought crystallized with sudden clarity. What she required was not the absence of marriage, but rather a particular kind of marriage, one that would satisfy legal requirements while preserving actual liberty. A marriage of pure convenience, entered into by two rational adults who desired the social protection of matrimony without its usual suffocating intimacy. Such an arrangement would need to be conducted with absolute transparency and mutual respect, based not on the ephemeral attractions of physical beauty or temporary passion, but on the solid foundation of shared self-interest. The question, of course, was where to locate such a partner. The marriage mart of London society dealt exclusively in romantic illusions or mercenary calculations of fortune and title. What she required existed so far outside the normal parameters of courtship that she could hardly place an advertisement in the Morning Post seeking a gentleman willing to marry without expectation of marital rights or romantic attachment. Yet even as the impossibility of her situation pressed upon her, Theodora felt her mind engaging with the problem, as it would with any intellectual puzzle. There had to be men in society who faced similar pressures, who chafed against familial expectations, who might welcome an escape that provided the appearance of conformity while preserving actual autonomy. Second sons, perhaps, who had no need for heirs but faced constant pressure to settle down. Scholars who preferred their studies to society. Men of independent means who found the endless pursuit of wives and the management of households a distraction from their true interests. The difficulty lay in identifying such a gentleman and approaching him with a proposal so unconventional that it might either liberate them both or destroy what remained of her reputation. Theodora returned to her desk and drew forth a fresh sheet of paper. She would not find her solution by waiting for fate to deliver it. Action, even uncertain action, beat passive resignation. She began to compile a list of possibilities drawn from her observations of society over the past decade. Men who had seemed as uncomfortable at Almack's as she felt, who had escaped to libraries during balls, who had shown more interest in books than in potential brides. The list grew slowly, each name accompanied by notes on what she had observed of character and circumstance. Some she eliminated immediately as too conventional or too desperate for heirs. Others seemed possible but too well connected to risk the scandal should the arrangement become known. By the time the mantel clock chimed noon, she had narrowed her possibilities to 3 names, and of these, one in particular caught her attention with persistent force. Lord Matteo Aldridge, second son of the Earl of Huntingdon, had been absent from society for nearly 5 years, pursuing archaeological studies on the continent. He had returned to London only recently, his appearance at a lecture on Grecian antiquities providing Theodora with her sole observation of him. Even in that brief glimpse, she had noted his discomfort in formal dress, the way his attention remained fixed on the speaker, rather than wandering to assess the assembled company. And most telling of all, the speed with which he had departed once the lecture concluded, avoiding the social pleasantries that usually followed such events. She had also observed, with a flush of awareness that irritated her considerably, the particular grace of his long scholar's hands as they gestured while he spoke briefly to a colleague, an irrelevant detail she had promptly dismissed as unworthy of consideration in so serious a calculation. More significantly, gossip suggested that Lord Matteo faced considerable pressure from his family to abandon his scholarly pursuits and contract a suitable marriage. His elder brother had recently married and produced an heir, rendering Matteo's own offspring unnecessary for succession. Yet the family apparently considered it improper for a gentleman of his standing to remain unwed at 32. His mother, in particular, was said to be campaigning vigorously to see her younger son settled. The symmetry of their situations struck Theodora with the force of revelation. Here was a gentleman who valued intellectual pursuits over social obligations, who had demonstrated by his extended absence that he preferred ancient ruins to modern drawing rooms, and who faced familial pressure to marry despite having no practical need for the connection. If ever there existed a candidate for the arrangement she envisioned, surely Lord Matteo Aldridge qualified. The question became one of approach. One could hardly send a note to a gentleman proposing marriage under any circumstances, let alone a marriage explicitly designed to be one in name only. Convention demanded that such matters proceed through careful social engineering. Accidental encounters that led to introductions, followed by a carefully calibrated dance of interest culminating in the gentleman's proposal. But Theodora possessed neither the patience for such maneuvers, nor the certainty that conventional courtship would lead to the unconventional arrangement she required. She would need an intermediary, someone who moved in both their circles and might facilitate a meeting in circumstances conducive to frank conversation. Her mental catalogue of acquaintances yielded one promising possibility: Mrs. Helena Wyndham, a widow of advanced years and radical opinions who hosted a salon devoted to scientific and philosophical discourse. Mrs. Wyndham had expressed interest in Theodora's anonymous essays and had extended several invitations to attend her gatherings, which Theodora had previously declined due to her father's disapproval of the hostess's progressive views. The decision made itself. Theodora would attend Mrs. Wyndham's next salon, would contrive to be introduced to Lord Matteo should he be in attendance, and would somehow navigate the treacherous waters between proper reserve and improper candor to determine whether her assessment of his character and circumstances warranted taking the final, irrevocable step of proposing her extraordinary bargain. Mrs. Helena Wyndham's residence in Bloomsbury occupied a curious position in London society. Too intellectually respectable to be completely ostracized, too unconventional to be embraced by the strictest arbiters of the ton. Her Thursday evening salons attracted an eclectic assembly of philosophers, scientists, reformers, and those members of the aristocracy whose curiosity exceeded their concern for reputation. It was precisely the sort of gathering that Theodora's father would have forbidden her to attend, which made her decision to defy him both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. The evening of her first attendance arrived with unseasonable warmth, London emerging from winter's grip with the tentative hope of spring. Theodora dressed with particular care, selecting a gown of deep blue silk that managed to be both fashionable and serious, avoiding the excessive embellishments that marked the very young and the determinedly marriageable. Her maid, loyal despite Sir Edmund's disapproval, arranged her dark hair in a style that suggested intellectual respectability rather than youthful flirtation. The journey from Grosvenor Square to Bloomsbury required a hired hackney, as Theodora refused to commandeer the family carriage for a destination her father would certainly condemn. The symbolic significance of this independence was not lost upon her. She was literally paying her own way toward a future of her own choosing, even if the precise shape of that future remained uncertain. Mrs. Wyndham's drawing room buzzed with animated conversation when Theodora arrived. The hostess herself, a handsome woman whose silver hair and keen gray eyes suggested wisdom rather than age, greeted her newest guest with warmth tempered by assessment. She understood, Theodora realized, exactly why a notorious spinster had suddenly decided to attend a gathering she had previously avoided. The assembled company represented a cross-section of intellectual London. University professors mingled with younger scholars, artists with patrons, writers with publishers, and scattered among them, a handful of aristocrats whose interests transcended the usual preoccupations of their class. Theodora accepted a glass of Madeira and positioned herself near a conversation about agricultural reform, content to observe while taking the measure of the room. She spotted Lord Matteo Aldridge within minutes of her arrival, though it took longer to confirm his identity. He stood somewhat apart from the main clusters of guests, examining what appeared to be an ancient Greek vase displayed on a side table with the focused attention of one who genuinely cared about such objects rather than merely pretending to appreciate them for social advantage. His appearance matched her memory from the lecture, tall and spare, with auburn hair that caught the candlelight and pale skin that spoke of more time in libraries than in ballrooms. His evening clothes, while perfectly proper, seemed to sit upon him with the awkwardness of costume rather than natural garment. Mrs. Wyndham, observing the direction of Theodora's gaze with the acuity that had made her a successful hostess, glided over to effect the necessary introduction. Lord Matteo, she announced, had recently returned from an archaeological expedition to Greece and possessed fascinating theories about the connection between ancient trade routes and the spread of philosophical ideas. Miss Sinclair, she added with deliberate emphasis, was known in certain circles for her essays on political economy and the rational organization of society. The introduction achieved its purpose with gratifying efficiency. Lord Matteo's attention shifted from the vase to Theodora with unmistakable interest, though not of the romantic variety that typically attended introductions between unmarried persons of opposite sexes. His gaze held curiosity and intellectual assessment rather than the calculating appraisal of a potential match. He expressed familiarity with the work of T. Blackwell, unaware that he was addressing the author herself, and ventured the opinion that Blackwell's recent essay on property rights had contained several provocative but defensible arguments. The conversation that followed ranged across philosophy, archaeology, and the proper role of government in regulating commerce. Theodora found herself engaged in the sort of intellectual exchange she had longed for throughout the tedious years of refusing suitors who could barely discuss topics beyond weather and horses. Lord Matteo possessed a first-rate mind unencumbered by the need to temper his opinions for feminine sensibilities. He treated her as an equal in their discourse, neither condescending nor gallant, simply present and engaged. As the evening progressed and the crowd around them shifted and reformed in the fluid patterns of social gatherings, Theodora became increasingly certain that her initial assessment of Lord Matteo's suitability had been correct. He clearly valued his scholarly pursuits above all else. His conversation revealed a man deeply uncomfortable with the usual demands of his position, who had fled to Greece not merely to study antiquities, but to escape the relentless pressure to conform to aristocratic expectations. When the topic turned, as it inevitably did in such company, to matrimony and its discontents, Lord Matteo's carefully neutral expression could not quite conceal his distaste for the institution. It was near the end of the evening, as guests began to make their departures, that opportunity presented itself in the form of a practical question. Lord Matteo mentioned his difficulty in securing access to certain collections of manuscripts held in private libraries, the owners of which were disinclined to admit a gentleman they viewed as peculiar for preferring dead languages to living society. Theodora, acting on impulse tempered by calculation, revealed her own extensive library inherited from her grandmother, which included several volumes of medieval texts and classical manuscripts. She extended an invitation, couched in the properly formal terms of one scholar to another, for Lord Matteo to examine her collection should he wish to pursue his research. The invitation was accepted with alacrity, and arrangements were made for his call the following Tuesday, during the hours when such visits were conventionally received. Yet even as they exchanged these proper courtesies, Theodora sensed that both of them understood this was not to be an ordinary morning call conducted under the watchful eyes of chaperones for the purpose of advancing a courtship. This would be something far more dangerous and potentially far more valuable. An opportunity for frank conversation between two intelligent adults who had both grown weary of playing roles society assigned them. Theodora departed Mrs. Wyndham's salon with hope kindling in her chest for the first time in months. She had found her candidate, or rather, fate and Mrs. Wyndham between them had delivered him. The question now became whether Lord Matteo Aldridge would prove brave enough or desperate enough to enter into the extraordinary bargain she intended to propose. The days until Tuesday passed with agonizing slowness. Theodora prepared for Lord Matteo's visit with the same meticulous attention she brought to her writing, considering every possible objection he might raise and formulating responses. She could not simply blurt out her proposition upon his arrival. Such abruptness would likely send him fleeing back to his family's townhouse, convinced she was mad. The approach required delicacy, a careful revelation of their mutual predicament, followed by the gradual introduction of her solution. She prepared the library with equal care, ensuring that the most impressive volumes were readily accessible and that the room itself conveyed serious scholarship rather than frivolous femininity. The manuscripts Lord Matteo had expressed interest in were set out on the reading table, an offering that would legitimize his visit while creating the necessary atmosphere for deeper conversation. Tuesday arrived with gray skies that threatened rain, the weather matching Theodora's inner turbulence. Lord Matteo appeared promptly at the appointed hour of 3 o'clock, his arrival setting off a minor commotion in the Sinclair household. Sir Edmund was mercifully absent on business in the city, but the servants whispered with excitement about the eligible gentleman calling upon the spinster daughter who had refused so many others. Theodora could practically hear them composing the gossip they would share in kitchens throughout Mayfair. Perhaps Miss Theodora had finally come to her senses and would accept this scholarly lord who seemed as odd as she was. Let them speculate, Theodora thought as she received Lord Matteo in the library. Their expectations would be disappointed soon enough, though not in the way they imagined. The first portion of the visit proceeded exactly as planned. Lord Matteo examined the manuscripts with genuine enthusiasm, his long fingers handling the delicate pages with the reverence they deserved. His commentary revealed the depth of his knowledge, moving easily between observations about paleography, historical context, and linguistic evolution. Theodora matched him insight for insight, demonstrating her own considerable learning while steering the conversation toward matters of more personal relevance. It was during a discussion of a particular medieval text on the rights and duties of property holders that Theodora saw her opening. The manuscript contained passages addressing the legal status of widows, who, unlike unmarried women, enjoyed certain freedoms in the management of their estates. She ventured the observation that the laws governing women and property had changed remarkably little since medieval times, and that unmarried women of fortune found themselves in the peculiar position of being wealthy, yet constrained by regulations designed to protect them from their own supposed incapacity. Lord Matteo's response revealed that he grasped the personal nature of her comment. He set down the manuscript and regarded her with those penetrating blue eyes that seemed to miss very little. His next words, carefully chosen, acknowledged his awareness that their conversation had moved beyond scholarship into more dangerous territory. He confessed that he too found himself constrained by expectations bearing little relation to his actual desires or needs. His family's campaign to see him married had intensified since his return, and he faced increasing pressure to abandon his research in favor of domestic duties he had no wish to perform. The moment had arrived. Theodora drew a steadying breath and embarked upon the most audacious speech of her life. She outlined her situation with brutal honesty, the refused proposals, her father's threats, the legal vulnerabilities of her position. She spoke of her need for the protection that only marriage could provide while maintaining the freedom that marriage typically destroyed. She described her vision of a union based on mutual convenience rather than romantic attachment, a business arrangement between equals who respected each other's autonomy. As she spoke, watching Lord Matteo's expression for signs of shock or revulsion, Theodora felt her fate balanced on a knife's edge. She had revealed too much, proposed too much, risked too much. If Lord Matteo proved conventional beneath his scholarly exterior, he could destroy her with a few well-placed words in the right drawing rooms. The scandalous spinster who had propositioned him with an offer of marriage stripped of all romantic pretense would become a figure of mockery throughout society. But Lord Matteo did not recoil. His face registered surprise, certainly, but also calculation and what might have been relief. When he finally responded, his words came slowly, each one selected with obvious care. He acknowledged the audacity of her proposal while admitting that it possessed a certain ruthless logic. His own situation, while different in specifics, shared enough commonality that her solution might serve them both. He required the freedom to pursue his studies without constant familial interference. She required the legal protection that only a married woman possessed. A marriage of pure convenience, conducted with complete transparency about its terms, might indeed answer both their needs. The conversation that followed ranged over practical matters with a frankness that would have horrified any proper chaperone. They discussed finances, establishing that Theodora's fortune remained entirely under her own control through the terms of her grandmother's will, and that Lord Matteo possessed independent income sufficient for his needs. They addressed the question of residence, agreeing that separate establishments would be maintained. She would keep the house in Grosvenor Square, part of her grandmother's bequest, whose full control would transfer to her upon marriage, while he would maintain his bachelor lodgings for his work. They spoke of social appearances, recognizing that they would need to present a credible front to society while living essentially separate lives. The most delicate topic, that of marital expectations and the production of heirs, required considerable diplomacy to navigate. Lord Matteo, his fair complexion coloring slightly, made clear that he sought no intimate connection and had no desire for children. Theodora, grateful for his directness, expressed identical sentiments. Their marriage would be one of legal convenience only, a shield against society's demands, rather than a union of bodies or even of households. As afternoon faded toward evening and the library grew dim with approaching dusk, they arrived at the outline of an agreement. Lord Matteo would court Theodora publicly, a brief but credible courtship that would satisfy society's expectations. They would marry quietly but legally, securing the protections each required. Following the marriage, they would maintain separate residences and independent lives, meeting only when social obligation demanded joint appearances. Most crucially, they would treat each other with honesty and respect, as partners in a business arrangement, rather than as romantic attachments constrained by expectations of love and devotion. Before Lord Matteo departed, Theodora insisted upon one final stipulation. Should either of them wish to dissolve the arrangement at any point, they would part as friends if possible, enemies only if absolutely necessary. Lord Matteo agreed, though he noted wryly that divorce would prove nearly impossible without scandal that would defeat the purpose of their arrangement. They would need to choose carefully, for this bargain, once struck, would bind them for life. The weeks that followed unfolded with the precision of a military campaign. Lord Matteo began calling upon Theodora with the regularity expected of a serious suitor. They attended lectures together, visited exhibitions at the British Museum, and were seen promenading in Hyde Park during the fashionable hours. To observers, they appeared to be conducting an eccentric courtship suited to their scholarly temperaments. Two odd individuals who had found each other and were proceeding toward matrimony at their own peculiar pace. Sir Edmund, initially suspicious of this sudden romance, found his objections mollified by Lord Matteo's title and respectable family connections. The younger son of an earl made a more than acceptable match for his troublesome daughter. And if the courtship lacked the usual romantic fever, well, that seemed appropriate for a woman of Theodora's advanced age and peculiar disposition. Lady Sinclair fretted that the match had come together too quickly, but even she could not deny that her youngest daughter had found a gentleman of suitable rank who seemed willing to tolerate her eccentricities. Throughout these weeks of public courtship, Theodora and Lord Matteo developed an unexpected companionship. Their conversations ranged across history, philosophy, and politics with the ease of genuine intellectual compatibility. They discovered shared opinions on matters from agricultural reform to the proper interpretation of classical texts. The marriage they had designed as pure convenience began to acquire layers of actual friendship, a development neither had anticipated but both welcomed as making their future arrangement more bearable. Yet even as their partnership solidified, Theodora found herself noticing details about Lord Matteo that had nothing to do with their practical arrangement. The way his auburn hair caught the light when he bent over a manuscript, the precise movements of his long fingers as he turned pages, the rare smile that transformed his usually serious expression into something almost boyish. These observations troubled her, suggesting as they did that her emotions might not be as firmly under rational control as she had believed. She dismissed such thoughts as the natural result of spending considerable time in close quarters with an attractive gentleman. Once they were married and maintaining separate households, such inconvenient awareness would fade. Their relationship would settle into the comfortable partnership they had designed, free from the complications of romantic attachment. The formal proposal, when it came, occurred during a visit to the British Museum on a rainy afternoon in May. Standing before the Rosetta Stone with a handful of other visitors studying the ancient inscriptions, Lord Matteo turned to Theodora and delivered the words required by convention. His tone conveyed no romantic passion, but rather the solemnity of a binding contract being ratified. Theodora accepted with equal gravity, and they shook hands on the bargain like businessmen concluding a commercial transaction. The wedding was arranged for early June after the banns had been properly read and the necessary settlements drawn up by solicitors. Theodora insisted upon terms that preserved her financial independence to a degree that scandalized the lawyers, but which Lord Matteo accepted without objection. His own solicitor seemed bemused by a groom who showed more interest in a clause protecting his bride's right to maintain separate residence than in the usual protections for a husband's authority over his wife's fortune. As the wedding day approached, Theodora told herself repeatedly that she had achieved exactly what she set out to accomplish. She would gain legal protection while maintaining practical freedom. Lord Matteo would satisfy his family's demands while preserving his scholarly pursuits. They would both escape the prison of conventional marriage by creating something entirely new, a union of mutual respect and shared self-interest, untainted by romantic illusions that inevitably soured into disappointment. Yet in quiet moments, usually late at night when sleep proved elusive, Theodora found herself wondering whether she had been entirely honest in her assessment of her own desires. The companionship she had developed with Lord Matteo felt more substantial than mere friendship, their intellectual connection more profound than simple compatibility of interests. She caught herself anticipating their meetings with an eagerness that seemed to exceed what mere business partnership should inspire. Such doubts, she firmly told herself, were merely the natural anxiety preceding any major life change. Once the wedding was accomplished, and they settled into their agreed-upon arrangement, these unsettling feelings would subside. She had designed this marriage to avoid precisely the sort of emotional complications that plagued conventional unions. She would not allow inconvenient sentiment to undermine the rational foundation upon which she had built her solution. The wedding of Miss Theodora Sinclair to Lord Matteo Aldridge took place on a bright morning in early June at St. George's, Hanover Square. The ceremony itself was modest by society standards, attended primarily by immediate family and a select group of friends. Theodora wore a gown of ivory silk trimmed with Brussels lace, elegant but not ostentatious, befitting a bride of 28 who had no pretensions to girlish innocence. Lord Matteo appeared in morning dress that, while perfectly correct, seemed to fit him with the same awkwardness as all formal attire, as though his mind remained focused on matters more significant than fashion. The words of the ceremony rang with traditional weight, binding them together before God and witnesses in language that had united countless couples across centuries. Yet as Theodora spoke her vows, she could not help but reflect on the vast distance between the conventional meaning of these promises and the actual terms of their private arrangement. She pledged to love, honor, and obey, while both she and Lord Matteo understood that their union was predicated upon mutual respect rather than romantic devotion, and that obedience formed no part of their negotiated settlement. The wedding breakfast held at the Sinclair residence in Grosvenor Square proceeded with the usual mixture of congratulations and barely concealed speculation. Theodora's sisters examined the groom with frank curiosity, clearly wondering what had finally induced their obstinate youngest sibling to marry after refusing so many supposedly superior offers. Lord Matteo's family, represented by his mother, Lady Huntingdon, and his elder brother, the current Earl, attended with expressions that suggested relief more than joy. They had secured the younger son's marriage and could now turn their attention to other matters. Throughout the festivities, Theodora and Lord Matteo maintained the performance required by their audience. They stood together receiving good wishes, cut the elaborate cake, and endured the usual jests about married life that made them both uncomfortable for different reasons than the speakers imagined. To all observers, they appeared as any newly married couple, perhaps somewhat older and more reserved than usual, but fundamentally following the expected pattern. The departure for their wedding journey provided the first test of their arrangement. Convention demanded that newlyweds retreat into romantic seclusion, but Theodora and Lord Matteo had agreed upon something rather different. They would travel to Lord Matteo's family estate in Derbyshire, a property he had inherited from a maternal uncle and which he maintained primarily as a repository for his archaeological collections. There, they would spend a month establishing the fiction of their honeymoon while actually engaging in the scholarly pursuits each found genuinely satisfying. The journey north took 3 days, traveling at a pace that allowed for reasonable comfort rather than romantic urgency. They shared the carriage, but maintained careful physical distance, conversing easily about topics ranging from the changing landscape to recent political developments. The nights spent at posting inns required separate chambers, a requirement Theodora had insisted upon and which Lord Matteo accepted without objection. Even this early in their marriage, they were already demonstrating that their union would defy conventional expectations. Ashton Park, Lord Matteo's estate, proved to be a sprawling Elizabethan manor set in considerable grounds that had been allowed to achieve a state of romantic wildness. The house itself showed signs of benign neglect, not precisely shabby, but lacking the meticulous attention that characterized estates where the owner actually resided for significant portions of the year. The servants, minimal in number but loyal to their absent master, greeted the new bride with curiosity barely concealed behind proper deference. It was here, in this place removed from London society's watchful eyes, that the true nature of their marriage began to reveal itself. Lord Matteo showed Theodora his collections with undisguised pride, rooms filled with artifacts from his Greek expeditions, carefully catalogued and arranged with scholarly precision. Ancient pottery lined shelves beside fragments of sculpture and cases of coins bearing the profiles of long-dead emperors. The library contained volumes in multiple languages, many of them rare manuscripts or first editions that made Theodora's own collection seem modest by comparison. They established a comfortable routine within days. Mornings were spent in companionable study, each pursuing individual projects in the library while remaining available for consultation when interesting discoveries warranted sharing. Theodora worked on a new essay addressing the education of women, arguing from historical precedent that female learning posed no threat to social order. Lord Matteo continued his research into ancient trade networks, surrounded by maps and texts in Greek and Latin. Afternoons brought walks through the estate's grounds, during which their conversations ranged across every topic imaginable. Theodora discovered that Lord Matteo possessed decided opinions on everything from architecture to agricultural improvement, delivered with a dry wit that she found increasingly appealing. He seemed to appreciate her own tendency toward sharp observation, laughing at remarks that would have shocked more conventional gentlemen. It was during these walks that Theodora began to acknowledge, despite her best efforts at rational denial, that her feelings toward Lord Matteo were evolving beyond mere friendship or business partnership. She found herself watching him when he did not notice, the way he squinted slightly when examining something closely, suggesting he ought to wear spectacles, but vanity prevented it. The animation that transformed his usually reserved features when discussing a subject that genuinely excited him. The kindness he showed to the estate's tenants during their chance encounters, treating working people with the same courtesy he extended to equals. Most dangerously, she discovered that his physical presence affected her in ways she had not anticipated. When they walked together and their arms accidentally touched, she felt an electric awareness that seemed entirely disproportionate to such minor contact. When he helped her over rough ground, his hand on her elbow sent warmth radiating through her body. These sensations disturbed her precisely because they contradicted the rational basis upon which their marriage had been founded. Lord Matteo, for his part, maintained perfect propriety. He treated her with unfailing respect, never presuming upon their married status to claim intimacies she had explicitly excluded from their agreement. Their chambers remained separate. Their interactions, while friendly and intellectually stimulating, preserved careful boundaries. If he felt any attraction toward her beyond appreciation for a compatible mind, he gave no indication. One evening near the end of their second week at Ashton Park, circumstances conspired to test the foundations of their arrangement. A severe thunderstorm struck with the sudden violence characteristic of summer weather, transforming the house into an island surrounded by sheets of rain. The aged roof developed several leaks, one of which unfortunately occurred directly above Theodora's bedchamber, forcing a hasty relocation of her belongings. The only available room suitable for a lady was adjacent to Lord Matteo's own chamber, separated by a connecting door that could be locked from either side. The symbolism was not lost on either of them as the housekeeper apologetically directed servants to transfer Theodora's trunks. They would now be sleeping with only a thin wooden door between them, a situation that would seem entirely natural to any conventional married couple, but which introduced unwelcome complications into their carefully calibrated distance. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed while rain pounded against the windows and thunder rolled across the Derbyshire hills, Theodora found sleep impossible. Her awareness of Lord Matteo's proximity dominated her thoughts. She imagined she could hear him moving about in the next room, though the storm's fury likely masked any actual sound. The connecting door seemed to pulse with significance, representing both the barrier that preserved their agreement and the threshold that, once crossed, would fundamentally alter everything between them. She told herself firmly that such thoughts were ridiculous. They had an arrangement based on rational self-interest, physical attraction, assuming she did indeed feel such inconvenient attraction, need not translate into action. She was perfectly capable of experiencing desire without acting upon it, of maintaining the boundaries they had established regardless of her body's treacherous responses. Yet even as she formulated these stern mental lectures, Theodora knew that something had shifted. The companionship of their first weeks of marriage, pleasant as it had been, now carried an undercurrent of tension. She had begun to want things their agreement explicitly excluded, to imagine scenarios that contradicted their carefully negotiated terms. The question that kept her wakeful through the storm's fury was whether Lord Matteo felt anything similar, or whether he remained content with their passionless partnership while she alone struggled with inconvenient desire. The remainder of their stay at Ashton Park unfolded under the shadow of that storm-filled night. The weather had passed by morning, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling, but the atmospheric disturbance within Theodora persisted, She found herself hyper-aware of Lord Matteo's presence, noticing details that should not matter, the way he absently ran his fingers through his auburn hair when puzzling over a translation, the precise shape of his hands as they held a manuscript, the rare moments when his serious expression gave way to genuine laughter. Lord Matteo, observant despite his scholarly preoccupation, clearly sensed that something had changed. His manner toward her grew cautious, as though he feared overstepping boundaries he could not quite identify. Their conversations, while still intellectually engaging, acquired a new constraint, words chosen with greater care than the easy exchanges of their earlier days together. They returned to London in late June to face the social obligations attendant upon their new married state. The house in Grosvenor Square, now officially Theodora's through the terms of her grandmother's settlement, which had stipulated transfer of full control upon her marriage, became their primary residence, though Lord Matteo maintained his bachelor lodgings ostensibly for the convenience of his work. To society's eyes they appeared as a somewhat unconventional but acceptable couple, a scholarly gentleman and his intellectual wife, who shared interests unusual for their sex, but not scandalous. The carefully maintained fiction of their marriage required regular performance. They attended dinners together, appeared at lectures and exhibitions as a united front, and received callers in the drawing room with tea and polite conversation. Theodora's sisters, visiting to assess how matrimony suited their once obstinate sibling, found nothing obviously amiss beyond the curious fact that Lord Matteo seemed to spend considerable time at his lodgings rather than his wife's residence. But maintaining the public facade grew increasingly difficult for Theodora as private truth diverged further from public performance. Her feelings toward Lord Matteo, no longer deniable even to herself, had evolved from intellectual appreciation to something far more complicated. She had fallen in love with her husband, a development so perfectly absurd and thoroughly inconvenient that she would have laughed had the situation not caused her such genuine distress. The rational part of her mind, which had always governed her decisions, insisted that this emotional development need not alter their arrangement. She had entered the marriage with clear eyes and explicit terms. That she had subsequently developed feelings Lord Matteo almost certainly did not share merely made their situation awkward, not impossible. She could continue as they had agreed, maintaining the fiction of their union while managing her inappropriate emotions with the same discipline she brought to all challenges. Yet the heart, as she was discovering, proved far less amenable to rational management than the mind. She caught herself watching for Lord Matteo's arrival when he called, feeling anticipation entirely disproportionate to what should be routine interaction between business partners. His departure left her inexplicably melancholy, the house seeming emptier than it had any right to feel. Most troublingly, she found herself imagining impossible scenarios. Lord Matteo confessing similar feelings, their marriage transforming from convenient fiction to genuine union, the connecting door between their chambers opening not through accident, but invitation. Such fantasies were dangerous precisely because they undermined the foundations upon which they had built their arrangement. She had proposed a marriage of convenience to preserve her freedom. Falling in love defeated that purpose as thoroughly as accepting a conventional match would have done. Love made one vulnerable, created dependencies, transformed rational partnership into emotional entanglement with all its attendant risks of pain and disappointment. The crisis point arrived in early July during a lecture at the Royal Society. Lord Matteo had been invited to present his research on trade routes in the ancient Mediterranean, and Theodora attended to show wifely support. The lecture itself proved fascinating, demonstrating the breadth of his knowledge and the clarity of his thinking as he moved between languages and epochs with practiced ease. The hall was steeped in reverent silence, suffused with the scent of beeswax and aged paper, the air thick with an intellectual attention that Theodora would ordinarily have savored. What undid Theodora's careful emotional management, however, was not the lecture, but what followed. A group of scholars surrounded Lord Matteo afterward, peppering him with questions and challenging his conclusions with the vigor that characterized genuine intellectual exchange. Watching him engage with these peers, seeing the animation in his face and hearing the passion in his voice as he defended his theories, Theodora felt something shift irrevocably within her chest. This was not mere physical attraction or intellectual compatibility. This was love in its most complete and terrifying form, the recognition of another soul whose happiness mattered more than one's own comfort, whose success inspired joy rather than competition, whose very existence seemed to illuminate the world with unexpected brilliance. She loved not just Lord Matteo's mind or appearance, but his essential self, the core of character that made him precisely who he was. The realization left her shaken. She had designed their marriage to avoid precisely this vulnerability. The rational bargain they had struck protected them both from the messy complications of romantic attachment. By falling in love with Lord Matteo, she had violated the fundamental terms of their agreement, even if her breach remained entirely internal and unknown to him. The carriage ride home from the Royal Society passed in near silence. Lord Matteo, still animated from the evening's intellectual engagement, seemed not to notice Theodora's unusual quiet. He spoke enthusiastically about several promising connections made during the reception, scholars who might provide access to collections or support future expeditions. Theodora responded with appropriate interest, hiding her inner turmoil beneath the practiced mask of composure she had perfected over years of deflecting unwanted suitors. Once home, she pleaded fatigue and retired early, leaving Lord Matteo in the library with a new volume that had arrived from his bookseller. In the privacy of her chamber, she finally allowed herself to confront the full magnitude of her predicament. She loved a man who had married her explicitly to avoid romantic entanglement. She yearned for intimacy with someone who valued their arrangement precisely because it excluded such complications. She wanted to transform their business partnership into genuine marriage, but doing so would betray the trust upon which their entire relationship had been founded. The cruelest aspect of her situation was that she could not even confess her feelings without potentially destroying what they had built. If Lord Matteo learned of her emotional evolution, he might feel obligated to address it, to either pretend reciprocal feeling he did not possess, or to awkwardly acknowledge his lack of similar sentiment. Either outcome would make their continued partnership impossible. The easy friendship they had developed would curdle into constraint and embarrassment. No, Theodora concluded as she stared sleeplessly at the ceiling, while the city's sounds drifted through her open window. She would have to manage this complication in silence. She would maintain their arrangement exactly as they had designed it, performing her role with the same competence she brought to all her endeavors, and somehow learn to live with love that must remain forever unexpressed and unacknowledged. The resolution, once made, should have brought relief. Instead, it merely clarified the dimensions of her private prison. She had gained legal freedom through this marriage only to find herself emotionally captive to feelings she could never reveal. August brought oppressive heat to London, sending those who could afford to escape fleeing to country estates and seaside resorts. The season had officially ended, giving way to the quieter months when society scattered and those remaining in town could move about with less scrutiny. For Theodora and Lord Matteo, the reduced social obligations should have provided welcome relief from the constant performance their arrangement required. Lord Matteo found himself increasingly unable to maintain the detachment their agreement demanded. In the privacy of his study, he would sit before an open manuscript for hours, eyes fixed on ancient Greek text that refused to resolve into meaning, because his mind insisted on wandering to the woman working in her own chamber down the corridor. He had designed this marriage as liberation from the very entanglements that now consumed his thoughts. The irony would have amused him if it did not cause such acute discomfort. He caught himself listening for the sound of her footsteps, manufacturing excuses to seek her opinion on matters he could perfectly well resolve alone, lingering in doorways simply to prolong their encounters by precious minutes. This was not the rational partnership he had negotiated. This was something far more dangerous, and he possessed no map for navigating such treacherous territory. Instead, the enforced proximity of summer in the city began to expose the cracks in their carefully constructed partnership. With fewer external engagements demanding their joint attendance, they found themselves spending more time together in the house on Grosvenor Square. The library became their shared refuge from the heat, its north-facing windows and thick walls providing relative coolness. They worked in companionable silence, interrupted by occasional exchanges of ideas or requests for opinions on passages they were writing. It was this very compatibility that tortured Theodora. Every shared intellectual moment, every instance of perfectly matched understanding, every laugh over some absurdity discovered in their reading served only to deepen feelings she could not express. She watched Lord Matteo across the library table and imagined crossing that distance, imagined touching him not in the accidental brushes of their daily interactions, but with deliberate intention, imagined speaking the words that crowded her throat, demanding release. Lord Matteo, meanwhile, had grown increasingly restless. He spoke often of returning to Greece in the autumn, of resuming the archaeological work that truly engaged his passion. The life they were living in London, however intellectually pleasant, seemed to chafe against his natural inclinations. He needed the freedom of expedition, the physical demands of excavation, the thrill of discovery that no library could provide. Theodora encouraged these plans with what she hoped appeared as wifely support for a husband's career. In truth, the prospect of Lord Matteo's departure for months or even years filled her with a dread she could barely acknowledge even to herself. His absence would provide relief from the constant strain of hiding her feelings, but it would also confirm the essential truth of their arrangement, that they were partners in name only, with separate lives that intersected only when convenience demanded. The crisis that finally shattered their careful equilibrium arrived not through any dramatic external event, but through the simple accumulation of unspoken truths threatening to breach the dikes of their composure. It began one evening in mid-August, when the heat had driven them to seek relief in the garden behind the house. Night had fallen, but brought little cooling, the air heavy with moisture that promised rain without delivering it. They sat in the garden's furthest corner, a bench partially obscured by climbing roses whose scent hung thick in the stillness. Lord Matteo had been describing his plans for the Greek expedition with unusual detail, as though seeking her approval or perhaps her objection. Theodora listened with outward calm while inwardly wrestling with the realization that his departure would leave her utterly alone with feelings that had nowhere to go. When she could bear the pretense no longer, she interrupted his description of excavation techniques with a question that surprised them both. She asked, with studied casualness that fooled neither of them, whether he had ever regretted their arrangement, whether the marriage of convenience had proven as satisfactory as they had anticipated during their original negotiations. The question hung in the darkness between them. Lord Matteo fell silent, and Theodora could feel rather than see his attention shift entirely to her. When he finally responded, his voice carried a tension she had never heard before. He said that the arrangement had proven satisfactory in all the ways they had designed it to be. It provided legal protection for her, social acceptance for him, and preserved the freedom each valued. But satisfaction, he noted with careful precision, was not the same as happiness, and their agreement had not anticipated certain complications that might arise from spending considerable time in such close quarters. Theodora's heart began to race. She asked what complications he meant, hardly daring to hope that his words implied anything beyond practical concerns. Lord Matteo hesitated, and in that hesitation, Theodora heard entire volumes of unspoken confession. He spoke haltingly of discovering that intellectual compatibility could create its own form of attachment, that respect and friendship might evolve into more complex emotions, that what began as business arrangement could become something harder to define and more difficult to maintain with the distance they had agreed upon. The admission, elliptical as it was, cracked open the door Theodora had kept so carefully locked. She responded with matching indirection, acknowledging that their arrangement had indeed grown complicated, that the boundaries they had established seemed increasingly arbitrary, that friendship and partnership did not adequately describe what had developed between them during their months of marriage. They spoke in circles and euphemisms, two intelligent people dancing around direct confession, each waiting for the other to break the pattern of careful restraint. Lord Matteo ventured that he had been reading recently about the ancient Greek concept of philia, the deep friendship between equals, and wondered aloud whether such connections sometimes transformed into something the philosophers had not adequately categorized. Theodora recognized the opening for what it was, but found herself retreating into academic discourse, discussing Aristotle's taxonomy of love while her heart hammered against her ribs with what she desperately wanted to say. Another silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words. Lord Matteo began again, speaking of how the rational mind might design a life only to discover that the heart possessed its own architecture, one that did not always align with careful planning. Theodora agreed too quickly, adding that surely such divergence need not destroy what had been rationally built, even as she wondered whether she was arguing for acceptance of her feelings or denial of them. The night deepened around them, and somewhere in the distance thunder rumbled, promising the relief of rain. Neither moved to return to the house despite the impending storm, as though they both sensed that something significant was unfolding in the darkness and could not be interrupted. It was Lord Matteo who finally abandoned circumlocution for directness. He turned to face Theodora fully, and though the darkness obscured his expression, she could hear the intensity in his voice as he asked whether she felt toward him anything beyond the friendly partnership they had negotiated. The question demanded honesty, and Theodora found herself suddenly exhausted by months of careful pretense. She confessed. The words tumbled out in a rush that would have appalled her rational self. She had fallen in love with him despite their agreement, perhaps because of their agreement, certainly against all her intentions and better judgment. She had tried to manage these feelings in silence, to maintain the terms of their arrangement, but found herself increasingly unable to pretend that their marriage remained purely practical when her heart insisted otherwise. Having confessed, she waited for Lord Matteo's response with the sick certainty that she had just destroyed everything they had built. He would be kind, certainly. He was too decent a man to respond to her admission with cruelty. But kindness in the face of unwanted emotion could cut deeper than any blade, and she braced herself for the gentle explanation that he valued their friendship but felt nothing more, that she must learn to accept the limits of what they could be to each other. Instead, Lord Matteo laughed. The sound, utterly unexpected, made Theodora stiffen with offended shock until his words clarified his reaction. He was laughing not at her confession, but at the absurdity of their mutual blindness. He informed her with something approaching wonder in his voice, spent the past months in identical torment, developing feelings he believed entirely inappropriate to their arrangement, watching her for signs of reciprocal interest, while firmly telling himself that she had married him precisely to avoid romantic entanglement and must not be subjected to unwanted attentions. They had both been suffering in silence, each convinced that the transformation of their affections betrayed the terms of their partnership, neither recognizing that the other had undergone the same alteration of heart. The realization struck them simultaneously. Their marriage of convenience had become inconvenient precisely because it had succeeded too well in creating genuine intimacy that their original agreement failed to accommodate. Rain began to fall, large drops splashing on leaves and flagstones with increasing urgency. Neither Theodora nor Lord Matteo moved toward shelter. Lord Matteo reached for her hand in the darkness, his touch tentative despite everything they had just confessed. His fingers, calloused from handling manuscripts and digging implements, closed around hers with surprising strength. He said her name, not Miss Sinclair or Lady Matteo, but simply Theodora, in a tone that made her breath catch. Then he asked, with endearing formality, given what they had already acknowledged, whether she would permit him to court her properly. Their marriage might have begun as business arrangement, but perhaps it could be renegotiated into something more authentic. They could start again, knowing what they knew now, and build upon the friendship and intellectual partnership they had already established. Theodora, rain now soaking through her gown and hair curling in the moisture, felt laughter bubbling up to match his earlier outburst. The absurdity of the situation struck her fully. They were married but proposing to court, legally bound but negotiating new terms, thoroughly drenched while conducting the most important conversation of their lives. She gave the only answer possible, accepting his courtship with the understanding that they would need to discover together what genuine marriage between them might mean. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke in earnest, rain falling in sheets that sent them racing for the house like children, laughing at the sheer ridiculousness of being caught outside in such weather. They burst through the garden door into the kitchen corridor, thoroughly soaked and grinning at each other with unrestrained delight. What followed required no elaborate planning or careful negotiation. They climbed the stairs together, and when they reached the landing where their chambers diverged, Lord Matteo, still holding her hand, paused. He asked with careful formality whether she might consider unlocking the connecting door between their rooms, not necessarily for immediate action, but as symbol of their renegotiated arrangement. Theodora, heart racing with anticipation and residual fear, agreed. The night that followed brought the consummation their marriage had deliberately avoided. But more significantly, it brought the final transformation of their relationship from business partnership to genuine union. They discovered that the sympathy of their minds found its echo in the harmony of their bodies, that the respect and friendship they had cultivated provided foundation for deeper intimacy, that what they had built through rational negotiation could evolve into something that defied rational explanation. Autumn brought changes to the household on Grosvenor Square that servants whispered about in kitchens and stables throughout Mayfair. Lord Matteo, who had maintained his own lodgings through the summer despite being legally wed, quietly gave up those rooms and consolidated his possessions at his wife's residence. The connecting door between the master and mistress chambers, previously kept locked by mutual agreement, now stood perpetually open. Most telling of all, the scholarly couple who had seemed content with intellectual partnership appeared to have discovered entirely different grounds for intimacy. Society, which had accepted their unconventional marriage with bemused tolerance, now regarded them with fresh interest. Invitations arrived in renewed quantities. Hostesses always welcomed couples who presented as genuinely attached rather than merely tolerating each other for form's sake. Theodora and Lord Matteo found themselves somewhat reluctantly drawn back into social circulation, though they limited their acceptances to events that genuinely interested them rather than feeling obligated to maintain constant visibility. The transformation of their marriage from convenient fiction to authentic partnership required ongoing negotiation. They discovered that love, however genuine, did not automatically resolve all practical considerations. Lord Matteo still needed time for his archaeological research, while Theodora remained committed to her writing and intellectual pursuits. The question became how to balance individual work with their newly acknowledged desire for actual companionship. The solution evolved organically through trial and revision. They established separate studies within the house, spaces where each could work without distraction, while reserving the library as shared territory for collaborative projects and companionable reading. Mornings remained devoted to individual work, but afternoons brought shared exploration of London's museums and libraries. And evenings unfolded in genuine togetherness rather than the careful performance that had characterized their early months of marriage. Most significantly, they learned to communicate with a directness their original agreement had never required. The carefully maintained boundaries that had governed their partnership gave way to honest exchanges about feelings, needs, and desires. When Lord Matteo expressed desire to return to Greece for an extended expedition, Theodora responded not with the wifely support she had previously offered, but with genuine objection. She would miss him, she said, and would prefer to accompany him rather than remain alone in London. The prospect of Theodora traveling with him to archaeological sites struck Lord Matteo as both impractical and perfect. Women of her station rarely embarked upon such expeditions, and the physical demands would be considerable. Yet the idea of sharing his work with someone who genuinely understood its significance, of exploring ancient ruins with a companion whose intellectual curiosity matched his own, proved irresistible. They began planning not just an expedition, but a fundamental restructuring of their life together. The house in Grosvenor Square would be maintained as their London base, but they would spend months at a time abroad pursuing research and exploration. Theodora's fortune, which had secured her independence, would fund archaeological work that might otherwise have languished for lack of financial support. Lord Matteo's expertise would guide their travels, while Theodora's sharp observation and analytical skills would contribute to the scholarly work. The partnership they envisioned would raise eyebrows, certainly. Wives did not typically accompany husbands on academic expeditions, particularly wives of aristocratic standing who should be hosting dinner parties rather than excavating ancient settlements. But they had long since ceased caring about society's expectations beyond maintaining sufficient respectability to avoid scandal that might damage their families. Lord Matteo's mother, visiting in September to assess how matrimony agreed with her younger son, found herself somewhat bewildered by what she discovered. Lady Huntingdon had expected to find Matteo settled into conventional domestic life, perhaps showing signs of interest in starting a family. Instead, she found a couple planning extensive foreign travel, more interested in ancient civilizations than in producing the next generation, apparently quite content with a marriage that looked nothing like what Lady Huntingdon considered proper. Yet even she could not deny that her son appeared happier than she had ever seen him. The restless dissatisfaction that had characterized his youth had given way to purposeful contentment, and his wife, that peculiar woman who had refused so many suitable offers before accepting Matteo, clearly made him happy in ways that transcended mere companionship. Sir Edmund Sinclair, observing his daughter's transformed circumstances during one of his rare visits, experienced similar confusion. He had expected Theodora's marriage to subdue her eccentricities, to channel her energies into appropriate domestic pursuits. Instead, she seemed more determined than ever to pursue intellectual work, now with the advantage of a husband who supported rather than constrained such ambitions. Sir Edmund could hardly complain. His troublesome daughter had married well and seemed content, but he privately thought the entire arrangement rather irregular. As autumn progressed toward winter, Theodora and Lord Matteo prepared for their first joint expedition, planned for the following spring. They studied maps and consulted with scholars who had excavated in Greece and Turkey. Theodora began learning modern Greek to supplement her classical education, while Lord Matteo assembled equipment and supplies for months of travel and field work. But beyond these practical preparations, they were also learning the more subtle skills required for genuine partnership. They discovered each other's habits and accommodated them. Theodora's tendency to work late into the night, Lord Matteo's need for early morning solitude. They learned to read each other's moods and respect the need for occasional distance even within intimacy. They found that love required effort and attention, that transforming a marriage of convenience into authentic union demanded ongoing choice and commitment. One evening in late October, as they sat together in the library reviewing field notes from Lord Matteo's previous expeditions, Theodora reflected aloud on how far they had traveled from their initial arrangement. The marriage they had designed with such rational precision had been demolished and rebuilt into something neither could have anticipated during those first careful negotiations. They had gained everything they sought: legal protection, personal freedom, intellectual partnership, but through means entirely different from what they had planned. Lord Matteo, looking up from the map he had been annotating, agreed with a smile that had become familiar in recent months. Their carefully constructed business arrangement had collapsed not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well, creating conditions in which genuine feeling could develop. They had both entered marriage determined to avoid emotional vulnerability, only to discover that real partnership required precisely that vulnerability they had sought to escape. The irony pleased them both. Two supremely rational people had designed a marriage to exclude passion and romance, only to find that intellect and emotion proved less separable than philosophy suggested. Their love had grown, not despite their careful planning, but because of it. Rooted in the mutual respect and honest communication their arrangement had demanded from the beginning. As winter settled over London and they continued their preparations for spring travel, Theodora and Lord Matteo discovered a final truth about their transformed marriage. The freedom they had both valued so highly, the independence that had driven them to seek this unconventional arrangement, proved more genuine in partnership than in isolation. True autonomy, they learned, came not from avoiding attachment, but from choosing attachment with someone who respected rather than constrained one's essential self. Their story would perplex society for years to come. This couple who married for convenience and discovered love, who rejected convention while maintaining respectability, who built authentic partnership from rational negotiation. But the opinions of others mattered less and less as they built a life together that honored both their individual pursuits and their shared commitment. On a clear December morning, as the first snow of winter dusted London's rooftops and squares, Theodora stood at the library window watching Lord Matteo cross the garden from his early walk. He moved with the purposeful grace she had first noticed at Mrs. Wyndham's salon, but now his arrival meant not duty or performance, but genuine homecoming. The door would open, he would bring cold air and book purchases from his walk past the booksellers, and they would spend the morning working in comfortable companionship, punctuated by shared discoveries and occasional touches that still sent electricity through her, despite months of marriage. She had set out to secure her independence through strategic matrimony and had succeeded beyond measure. But she had also gained something she had not known to seek: a genuine partner whose presence enhanced rather than diminished her freedom, whose love felt like liberation rather than constraint, whose intellectual companionship had somehow transformed into the deepest intimacy she had ever known. The spinster who had refused every proposal had finally found her perfect match in the most imperfect of arrangements. The marriage of convenience had become inconveniently, wonderfully real. And so, another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, sometimes precisely because two rational people attempted to circumvent it entirely, only to discover that the heart possesses wisdom the mind cannot anticipate. For in their strategic pursuit of freedom, Miss Theodora Sinclair and Lord Matteo Aldridge discovered the most valuable of truths: that the truest marriages flourish not from fleeting passion, but from mutual respect, proving that convenience may indeed serve as the most surprising foundation for love freely chosen and continually renewed.